All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for taking time today to join us for the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. This is a colloquium series that is sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and organized and maintained by the Center for Interdisciplinarity. I'd like to begin with Michigan State University land acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. When I'm finished with the introduction, I will put in chat a couple of links to additional resources that provide more information about the land acknowledgement. As I mentioned, this is the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. It's a forum that the Center for Interdisciplinarity organizes to feature interdisciplinary work that involves humanistic and artistic perspectives. We're dedicated in the center to doing what we can to highlight the important work of interdisciplinary scholars on campus, especially insofar as the interdisciplinary work they're doing has close connection with the humanities and the arts. Some of the best and most innovative interdisciplinary work at universities like Michigan State involve humanistic and artistic perspectives, even though perhaps that's not obvious. So much of the work that's funded, especially funded at a high level, is STEM interdisciplinarity, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Based interdisciplinarity and humanities and arts can kind of get lost in the wash a little bit. And so this series is really focused on emphasizing and underscoring just how cool the work that involves those perspectives is and how important and influential it is. This series meets every other week in the fall and the spring. We have our last UIC for the 2020-2021 year in 2 weeks on the 16th of April. At the same time, the link that you use today to access this talk is the link that will work for the next interdisciplinary colloquium as well. Our speaker then will be Dr. David Godden, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University. And Dr. Godden will deliver a presentation entitled, "Is Persistent Disagreement a Reason to Distrust?" So that's in 2 weeks' time on the 16th. Today, we're thrilled to have with us NiCole T. Buchanan, PhD. Dr. Buchanan is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Michigan State University, whose research focuses on harassment and its impact on organizational climate, employee well-being, and professional development. Specifically, Dr. Buchanan examines barriers to equity and inclusion in higher education, focusing on how evaluations of faculty research reflect both discipline-based and identity-based biases that result in the formal and informal epistemic exclusion of marginalized scholars and the scholarship they produce. Dr. Buchanan also studies the interplay of race, gender, and victimization, and how social identity dimensions impact the nature of harassment, for example, racialized sexual harassment, how it's perceived by targets and bystanders, its impact on psychological, occupational, and academic outcomes, as well as organizational best practices. Dr. Buchanan is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, 4 divisions of the American Psychological Association, and she's also received national and international awards for her research, teaching, and professional service. She's on the advisory committee for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Action Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. And she served on the Research and Content Expert Work Group for the U.S. Government Accountability Office and the U.S. Congress in conjunction with the National Academies to examine the prevalence and cost of sexual harassment in the U.S. workplace. She's been highlighted in hundreds of media outlets as a featured speaker, including TED Talks and National Public Radio, and provides bias and diversity training, or related training, and consultation for a number of different types of professionals, including medical professionals, academic and practicing psychologists, human resource managers, campus, city, and state police departments around the country. Today, we are very, very lucky to have her with us to deliver a talk entitled Epistemic Exclusion and Research Biases, How Scholarly Elitism Limits Scholarly Innovation and Relevance. Dr. Buchanan.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It was a wonderful introduction. I feel very honored to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I don't do very well at tracking the chat, so I'm going to invite the leaders of C4I to let me know if there are important chat questions that come up. I don't mind answering questions during talks, so that will be perfect for me on my end.
You bet. We'll take care of that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So first, I want to thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. I've had the pleasure of presenting this work around the country, but there really is something very special about having the opportunity to share it with members of our MSU community. And as MSU is striving to live up to its land-grant mission, inherent in that task is recognition that epistemic exclusion and our research biases are actually stymieing our efforts at inclusion and our ability to have our scholarship reach its full potential with regard to things like innovation, impact, and relevance for the general public. So as I start this talk, I do want to thank our amazing and wonderful funders. I want to acknowledge that this work is possible because of the funding that we received across several programs, both local and federal. And despite what I hope you will agree is the clear brilliance of this work, I do want to remind you that our findings, opinions, conclusions, and recommendations are those of our research team. They do not necessarily reflect those of our funders. And speaking of our research team, perhaps especially important to note for a talk at the Center for Interdisciplinary, I want to introduce you to our team, some of which you may recognize. This is my amazing group of collaborators, and as you can see, we are a very diverse interdisciplinary team. We represent different genders, race, disciplines, perspectives, and scholarly approaches. And this is incredibly important because this diversity leads to our scholarly excellence and innovation, and our diversity directly contributes to our team's success. Scholar Michelle Fine described academia as an increasingly gated community where exclusivity acts as the rule, and notes that there's a creeping, hegemony of publications and grants that creates a very limited definition of what we consider rigorous, valid research methods, topics, or populations of study. And our scholarship really needs to expand to embrace the richness and the nuance that's involved when we center social justice and concepts like intersectionality and diversity, and then we create more space for those topics to exist within the scholars, students, and our practice theory and research. But integrating our science with these kinds of tenets demands that we also are going to have to expand our skills and our tools to make this vision of academia a possibility. We have to implement policies, practices, and methodologies that will actually promote a more socially just science and practice, and invite in scholars that represent the world out there so that we can generate scholarship that's relevant to that real world context. But this is not going to be an easy task. So today I'm going to discuss why academia has resisted these types of frameworks, highlight some of the biases and blind spots that hinder our ability to support and recognize more diverse research and the scholars that produce that research, and offer some strategies for increasing our integration of this research practice and practice within academia more broadly. Now, I believe that a shift such as the ones that I'm requesting or naming will increase diverse scholars in our various fields across academia. It will transform the nature and questions that we ask within our research, the manner that we're conducting our work and our interventions, and the relevance of our scholarship for the populations that we serve. Now, why does this lack of diversity matter? A diverse faculty body is a critical component of educational excellence and research innovation. Demographic diversity is associated with intellectual and creative advancements that surpass those of homogenized groups. Faculty gender and racial heterogeneity increases the diversity of thinking that's necessary for advancing research innovation and contributing to global scholarship, being global leaders. Diverse research teams are associated with more innovative solutions to problems and solutions that actually influence the field as measured by things like increased citations, increased patents, increased reference to papers that are produced by these kinds of diverse teams. And the inclusion of women faculty and faculty of color expands our fields by asking new questions, developing new subfields, and applying our established knowledge in new ways and with new populations. One perfect example is the research documenting heart attack survival disparities between men and women, and the fact that we never knew this because we didn't include women in any of the studies. So when diverse teams are involved, their work often appeals to a broader mass of the population. This then increases the chance that it's going to be adopted and reduces the research to practice lag, which, if you are not familiar with this concept, it often is at least 17 years before the interventions and the research that we produce actually is adapted in the general public. Faculty diversity increases student diversity as well as student academic successes as measured by things like graduation rates and their student achievement. And the students that are taught by diverse faculty demonstrate greater cognitive flexibility, higher order thinking, better problem solving abilities, and better communication skills. Now, despite all of these documented benefits of diversity, we continue to hear discussions of if we want diversity or the best candidate, pitting scholarly excellence and innovation against diversity that's embedded in the people and in this kind of research. And unfortunately, such questions contribute to the fact that diversity, it remains rare in academia. Now, if we look across campus, most faculty are already pretty successful in their scholarly endeavors that have teams that do not reflect much diversity. And this can make it very difficult for different scholars to really embrace this idea that they should be considering diversity across their research team and across the scholarship that we're producing. So I'm going to give you some of the reasons why I believe it's important for you to think about and value diversity across teams and across scholarship. So as I've already hinted at, diversity itself leads to better science and better scholarship overall. And the absence of this diversity is costly. For example, we can miss important differences in response to treatment, such as the example that I gave earlier about heart attack survival rates. In this case, the decades of only studying men until the very recent past literally cost many, many women their lives. And the findings from studies that we do have actually only apply to a very small segment of the population and leaves out the global majority. I can use my own field as an example. In psychology, they determined that over 80% of the research reflects only 5% of the population in our world. 5%, white, educated, intellectual, often college students in Psych 100 classes is the vast majority of the research. We also end up suffering the unmeasured losses due to diminished reputations. And this is something we don't talk about often, but there is a diminishment of the reputation of individuals, research fields, and institutions when people begin to understand that they are unresponsive to diverse people. And we then perpetuate this problem of the lack of diversity, and it's because it's contributing to this restricted pipeline of diverse talent down the road. And so it may be unusual to speak in an academic, while this might be unusual to talk about in this academic center, we really have to care because it's the just thing to do. And this maybe is more my particular bend on this, but our scholarship very much should be in service of and relevant to the populations that are funding our research via their hard-earned tax dollars. Oh, sorry about that. So if we know that diversity is beneficial, why does it continue to be so hard for us to actually achieve it? Well, compared to their representation in the US, Asians and non-Hispanic whites are actually overrepresented among full-time university faculty, whereas Black, Latinx, and Native Americans are underrepresented. And although women's representation among full-time faculty has been increasing by almost 12% over the past 20 years, there has been very little change among faculty of color. Increases range from as little as 0.1% for Native American faculty to 2% for Latinx faculty. And there is an exception when we consider Asian faculty, where they have had a significant increase from 5 to 10%. And these disparities increase as faculty move through academic ranks, such as the percentage of assistant to full professors decreases by up to 50% if we look at underrepresented minority faculty, and decreases by 19% for women faculty. And notably, underrepresented minority faculty and gender disparities are exacerbated in certain fields, such as STEM, with women filling 19 to 31%, and underrepresented minority faculty filling as few as 0.1 to 5.1% in some STEM faculty positions. And I also want to note that this is still a limited story because those individuals who cross identities are notably absent. For example, less than 0.8% of full professors are both Black and female. And the lack of diversity has a number of negative consequences that we need to consider. For example, most scholars have had very little exposure to the kinds of high quality, relevant research that's related to diverse populations. And this lack of exposure means that they are unprepared to have discussion about, let alone actually do research on, issues related to diversity and social justice. And this increases our resistance to the topic and a reluctance to engage those who discuss and study these issues. If I go into psychology a little bit, the prejudices that people are experiencing create a cognitive dissonance. And this is then resolved by disparaging research on these topics, despite the fact that they often have very little exposure to it. And perhaps even more importantly, there's a tendency to then disparage the people who are forcing us to contend with these issues via their research or their membership in marginalized social groups. Resistance to these topics then creates a hostile environment for scholars of color, especially if they're doing diversity-related or social justice-related research, and marginalizes them as individuals, devalues their work and their contribution, and as a result, many consider leaving the field, and many actually do. Further, the absence of mid-career and senior faculty of color and the relative lack of diversity-related research and training alienates students at every possible level. Both undergraduate and graduate students of color self-select out of these fields, choosing instead to be in fields that better represent them as human beings, but also their research interests. So at a minimum, if we want to better recruit and retain diverse students and faculty, the field has to embrace their presence, their population foci, and the diversity and social justice related scholarship that they are often interested in doing. The slow change for underrepresented minority faculty, I'm going to often just say URM faculty, and the modest change for women faculty suggests that existing efforts to diversify academia have really had very limited success. And when we do have these groups enter, their turnover is still quite high, and efforts to retain them are undermined by institutional and interpersonal challenges that are disproportionately targeting and impacting these faculty. And some examples of this would be a sense of not belonging within the institution, being ostracized, experiencing incivility, marginalization, isolation, and tokenism. My team and I propose that epistemic exclusion is a form of scholarly devaluation and is an underexamined phenomenon that is associated with a variety of negative workplace perceptions, as well as things like worsened health, physical health as well as psychological outcomes when we're looking at women faculty and underrepresented faculty of color. Before I do a deep dive into epistemic exclusion, I want to first give you some examples of the kinds of scholarship that reflect being within a disciplinary center and contrasting that with some of the scholarship that is often deemed at the disciplinary margins. And I will say these are examples that may or may not apply to any particular field, but every field could generate a similar kind of list. So often work at the center of a discipline will reflect only those disciplinary norms, whereas work on the margins is more likely to, say, be interdisciplinary. Work in the center of a discipline might focus on basic processes or be more theoretical, whereas work on the margins may be more often applied research and work. Work in the center is more likely, for example, my field of psychology, more likely to be quantitative rather than qualitative, may focus more on biological factors more than behavioral factors. And traditional research will often prioritize generalizable results that might cut across an average population rather than doing research that's very specific to a particular population of interest. They may also focus on dominant groups when we're talking about research that's within the center, and versus work that focuses on marginalized group members and concerns. And centered research often purports to be untouched by values and bias versus research that is often marginalized, often acknowledges that it is political and deeply personal. And traditional research pretends that the researcher themselves are neutral. They're a neutral conduit for this post-positivist truth, that any potential bias in the study is going to be controlled by the research process itself, as opposed to marginalized research that is often central to the life of that researcher. And it is often personal, where their bias is actually acknowledged because the research is embedded in factors that make it impossible to actually be neutral. In fact, I would argue that often being neutral could actually reflect pathology because they're working in things that are directly connected to human suffering. My colleagues and I propose that epistemic exclusion actually is distinct from academic gatekeeping. Academic gatekeeping is designed to help protect the field, upholding the rigor of a discipline. But instead, when we're talking about epistemic exclusion, those with power have been successful by engaging in very traditional mainstream scholarship, and this has yielded them epistemic power. And they then use that epistemic power to establish and maintain disciplinary norms and to define what work is considered marginal and what work is considered innovative and groundbreaking. Epistemic exclusion functions to both reify dominant and traditional academic endeavors by creating methods of scholarly assessment and recognition that then privilege mainstream research and mainstream researchers. And because the existing system is one that's made them successful, it's one that's worked, it's made them powerful, they often have little incentive to actually challenge it and to change it. And so the harm is disproportionately felt by those who do research constrained to the margins. This process limits the proliferation of marginalized research and the dissemination of findings. And a recent study by Hofstra and colleagues found something that they've named the diversity innovation paradox. They looked at over 1 million US doctoral recipients over a total of 30 years. And the last cohort they tracked was 2015. And they looked at their post-graduation careers. What they found was underrepresented groups tended to conduct work that was more novel in their fields. And the research tended to be more innovative than their counterparts, but they weren't being rewarded similarly for doing innovative work. Specifically, innovative research by women and by racial minorities was underutilized by other scholars, and the more innovative their work was. This is really counter to our logic, but the more innovative their work was, the less likely it would be that they were offered research positions or the kinds of rewards that we would typically accrue as researchers. Other research also supports that these scholars, when they do break through, when they do get these positions, they're less likely to be cited and to be referenced by white scholars or male scholars, regardless of how innovative their research might be. Epistemic exclusion is, as I've said, is a form of scholarly devaluation that is rooted in a set of invisible biases. These biases are both discipline-based and identity-based. And those biases then end up infused throughout systems of evaluation. So epistemic exclusion would assert that these seemingly neutral performance standards actually do reflect disciplinary biases about the characteristics of what is good scholarship, and that these biases then center mainstream research in these two distinct ways. So one, that there is prejudice towards faculty of color. And this is rooted in negative stereotypes about their intelligence or about their foreignness. But of course, this is socially unacceptable. And as such, this bias is often indirectly, not directly expressed. And the way it's indirectly expressed is through devaluing the non-traditional research they're more likely to be doing. The second form of bias reflects the assumption that any legitimate scholarship in our discipline is going to follow our disciplinary norms. And for many fields, this includes things like objectivity or research neutrality, that our research is bias-free, that it's going to focus on dominant groups, or concerns that dominant group members have identified as being important and relevant for the field. But it's important to also note that their social position, the situatedness as it's often referred to, and their outsider within status increases the likelihood that marginalized group members are going to have different lived experiences. They're going to have differences from dominant group members. And this is going to have an impact on their scholarly endeavors. And it's going to make it more likely that they want to conduct research that might be outside of disciplinary norms. So being outside of those disciplinary norms also means then that they're likely to be deemed as illegitimate scholars. And before I move from this slide, I want to also make an important point that the second form of bias actually is acting as cover for the first. When someone has these implicit biases, they can express this prejudice by rejecting the non-traditional scholarship that marginalized group members are more likely to be engaging in. So rather than saying that, oh, well, those faculty members are not competent, they can just fall back on perceived problems with certain types of scholarship, which in academia is perfectly accepted, correct? This then allows them to pretend that the fact that marginalized faculty are the ones doing that research is coincidence. And so devaluing the research somehow is not about devaluing the scholars. These disciplinary biases about the boundaries of quality scholarship are coupled then with the identity-based biases regarding marginalized individuals. And this thwarts the possibility for objective evaluation processes. Given that faculty merit is determined by those kinds of systems of evaluation, these forms of bias are disproportionately impacting the hiring, advancement, and promotion of women and faculty of color, and then act as barriers to inclusion and equity and their full scholarly engagement within our various disciplines. In our studies, we have found that epistemic exclusion, I'm going to often be using EE for epistemic exclusion, occurred in a number of ways that could loosely be grouped into what we would call formal and informal processes. First, epistemic exclusion operated informally. These were times where faculty accomplishments were often unrecognized. Maybe the faculty were deemed as illegitimate scholars. Their work may have been perceived as incomprehensible. We differentiate the two categories by saying the informal processes were not really codified within university procedures and hierarchies, but nevertheless, their impact was quite significant. But in the interest of time today, I'm going to focus in on the formal processes because I also believe these are where we can act most readily. The formal hierarchies reflected the ways that institutions established evaluative systems that then reified these disciplinary norms and then denoted which scholarship and types of academic engagement were going to be seen as valuable, important, significant, rewarded, things like that. These formal hierarchies of evaluation are then used to make merit, promotion, and tenure decisions. And in particular, these evaluation structures rendered certain types of scholarship as being lower in quality based on perhaps the topic. For example, if it was on marginalized groups, social problems, or maybe medical diagnoses that are more common among certain marginalized groups. Maybe it was because of the method, for example, if it's qualitative or versus quantitative, but also things like the publication outlets, whether it was deemed a top tier outlet or a lesser journal, and whether it received federal grant funding. And there are a number of different ways in which epistemic exclusion was embedded in the formal hierarchies. Here I'll discuss just a couple of them. For example, faculty reported that the standards around scholarship and performance requirements were often unclear, or they seemed to change. Particularly, they felt that higher standards were often applied to them compared to white or male colleagues. And in particular, once they began to achieve a standard, it would suddenly shapeshift. So they were once again being defined as missing the bar or not being good enough. And there were particular challenges in how outside rubrics were used to validate research quality. For example, federally funded grant-based research being conferred higher value, and then the size of the grant further being used to scale their value. And this continues despite decades of evidence that research grants from people of color are less likely to receive NIH and NSF funding compared to white and male scholars. There are several different ways in which publication outlets were subjected to EE. For example, the research quality is often assessed by the perceived quality of the publication outlet, whether we're talking about a journal or press. This is then determined, this is being determined by criteria like their impact factor and their rejection rates, as well as their perceived prestige. I'm going to take a moment to describe why some of these are really grossly inappropriate. Impact factors themselves were never intended to serve as an assessment of the quality of an individual paper. Impact factors are heavily influenced by subscribership, and subscribership is heavily influenced by the extent to which the content of that journal or that press appeals to a very wide mainstream audience. So journals with the highest impact factors tend not to focus on social justice issues, don't publish research on marginalized populations, and don't focus on topics related to these populations. And when they do accept these papers, it's far fewer papers per year compared to research that is deemed mainstream. As a result, research that appeals to a very small body of scholars or smaller body of scholars is more likely to then be published in specialty journals rather than the broad appeal journals, regardless of its quality. In fact, there have been recent audits that have spanned years of publications in the field of psychology, looking at, is there bias in psychology journal publications? And they found that research that's conducted by scholars of color or research focused on topics related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is 12 times more likely to be rejected than accepted. Some of these studies also did experimental manipulations, looking at diversity versus mainstream research that's high or low quality. And they found stark differences in how such manuscripts are being assessed by reviewers. And specifically, they found that mainstream research of low quality is given the benefit of the doubt and is published, while similar diversity-related research is subjected to greater scrutiny and rejection. Interestingly, high quality research, they did not find the bias was there. It was more the middle of the road bias. Thus, federal grants and publication outlets are used to define what research is of quality and what should be cast to the margins, without acknowledging that each of these criteria favor traditional disciplinary scholarship, and as a result, the research on disciplinary margins is disadvantaged in the evaluation process, regardless of its overall quality. And our research shows that the consequences of EE are substantial for individuals experiencing it and are substantial for the institutions and for academia as a whole. EE levies substantial tolls for individuals in the domains of their work, research, and their career progression. For example, to avoid EE, faculty sometimes limited the research that they were doing that they were passionate about, or even changed the scope of their research altogether in order to better fit into disciplinary norms. But as a result of this, they found that they were less productive and less excited, interested, or engaged in the work that they were doing. And epistemic exclusion had consequences for promotion and tenure decisions. When the work that faculty of color did was being perceived as not good enough, or if the research was being presented in biased ways because it was on the margins, they were much less likely to be successful, even if they had hit the standard marks for success. And faculty recognized that being devalued also impacted their salary, because they weren't receiving the merit pay raises that were on par with the contributions they were making. And there were psychological effects of epistemic exclusion. Faculty felt unhappy and dissatisfied with their jobs. They felt that they didn't belong and they weren't welcomed in their institutions, and felt that they didn't have control over their future or their careers. Many faculty described these experiences as crazy making, or feeling like they were crazy. And we likened this to gaslighting, because the messages that they were receiving from their colleagues and from their chairs differed from their self-perceptions, and often differed from the feedback they got from individuals that also studied similar topics. And one of the things that I am always fascinated about are the institutional consequences, because I think this is where we can get institutions to really begin to see that this is an important, serious issue. One of the most obvious institutional consequences of EE is high faculty turnover. And many also talk about reputational harm. This is reputational harm that comes to the institution or to a particular department, but it can even be expanded to a field when it becomes known as an area that is not supportive of faculty of color or of women. Further, our team suggests that epistemic exclusion actually produces disciplinary inertia, such that things continue to be done as they've always been done. And so innovation actually happens far more slowly as a result. Those disciplines who experience this loss of research innovation, they're experiencing a loss also of novel questions, new applications and adaptations, limited dissemination, and a reduced proliferation and adaptation of the interventions or the knowledge that they are creating. And this continues that disconnect between the ivory tower, the populations we educate and serve, and the public that's funding our work. So what else is required? This all begs the question of what it is we can and should do to change the status of academia as it pertains to research and inclusion. And one, we have to begin to address the climate concerns that have a disproportionate negative impact on diverse faculty. For example, targets of workplace bullying, mistreatment, and exclusion are not random. In studies, roughly 80% of Black respondents, 73% of women, 46% of LGBT faculty talk about being bullied and harassed at work. And these behaviors are more common for both older workers and younger workers. And this is socializing younger workers or younger colleagues that success in academia requires these bad kind of behaviors. And targeting younger workers may actually be particularly costly for the institution, because the younger workers are more likely to be mobile and are more likely to leave. Some of the individual consequences of harassment and bullying include things like increased physical health problems, decreased life expectancy, so early death, suicidal ideation, decreased work productivity, cognitive challenges and decreased problem-solving abilities, decreased commitment to work, and a disengagement from their research. And perhaps this is obvious, but those who are targeted tend to be outside of the dominant structure within academia, and they tend to have less power already. So the costs and the burdens of bullying are disproportionately being built on the backs of those that are already the most vulnerable. And organizations experience significant consequences for workplace mistreatment that they allow to occur. Over $64 billion is lost to workplace bullying every single year. And this is for a number of different reasons. There's lost time and productivity, disengagement and withdrawal from students and from research, premature retirement. And in fact, if we were to add together the average time that is lost as a result of having to cope with, react to, and strategize how to deal with bullying and its associated shame and fear, it comes out to nearly 4 hours every single week, which translates into 195 hours per year, or a full 5 weeks of time. Now, if we presume we're paying faculty a salary of roughly $50,000 a year, this means that almost $10,000 of their salary is dedicated to coping with harassment and bullying behaviors alone, which adds up. And we know that faculty turnover is extremely, extremely expensive. In fact, it's estimated that it costs 150% of one's salary to replace somebody who has left. Some of the costs involved in that involve of course, the lost productivity of that employee before they left, but also lost productivity for the people that have to now do the search and find their replacement. We have to re-advertise positions, interview, recruit, retrain, and as well as pay overtime to people that are doing the work that that employee had once done. As a result, the employee that was making $50,000 is now going to cost us $75,000 to replace. And this doesn't even account for the fact that over time, new faculty tend to make higher salaries. So replacing that person may mean that we're actually replacing them with someone who's making more money than the person that left. And transforming the culture of academia requires a transformation in who is actually in the field. We have to significantly increase the diversity of the pipeline of undergraduate and graduate student trainees if we hope to have a real impact on the field and the faculty workforce in any real significant way. This is going to require that we increase faculty diversity at all levels and that we actually retain them. We've had this leaky pipeline that has challenges for people of color at the entry, especially when we're talking about people that have multiple intersecting marginalized identities, such as first generation, low income, or queer women of color. And being underrepresented in the field, having your research interests marginalized, and learning about the kind of negative experiences that other faculty members have actually detours our graduate students and our undergraduate students from going into academia as a career. And when they do, those that do, we have difficulties in retaining them because they continue to face these kinds of struggles. So if we are going to diversify academia, it's going to require that we understand the kind of unique stressors that multiply marginalized students and faculty are facing, particularly barriers they have to the research being embraced and being recognized as valid. And to create change, we have to also evaluate and transform our standards for research, publications, and grants within academia. We have to make the more substantive study of variables like race, social class, ethnicity, gender, as well as their intersections, the gold standard for good scholarship. This shift is going to also require that we look at research research reporting requirements and publication venues, and ensure that they're also requiring inclusion. So at a minimum, when doing research about human beings, publication venues should be requiring that authors are reporting the relevant demographic variables about their samples, and they're defining the extent to which their findings can actually be generalized across groups, instead of assuming that our research on white college students in Psych 100 classes actually generalizes to the whole world. And if this seems like it's just common sense, to be clear, recent issues of high impact journals continue to publish scientific studies without providing the relevant demographic information. And they don't provide it on just the basics, but they also don't provide it in how we cross, so we can know about specific groups within a sample. And they typically do not actually examine if their findings held across the different groups within their sample. So given that this is the state of the field, of many fields, we have a very long way to go before we start to see that these are established norms, and that we go even further in being able to look at, now, how do intersecting identity groups, how do the findings relate to them? So moving forward, it is important that we understand the role and the impact of epistemic exclusion at all levels of the educational spectrum. If we think about education, we are teaching graduate students our disciplinary norms. This then influences what knowledge students are exposed to, and then influences what kind of research they are encouraged or discouraged from pursuing, and which research topics are deemed valid for them to examine. If we look at hiring, our job ads are often written in ways that can exclude people who are doing more novel work on the margins. This impacts the applications that are actually received, but it also impacts how those applications are reviewed and who is considered or who is not considered for positions. Epistemic exclusion is particularly impactful also for promotion, which our studies have been on faculty, so it makes sense that that's one of the areas that came up over and over again. But the impact on promotion also contributes to turnover, or the phenomenon we've often referred to as the sticky floor, where women and faculty of color are disproportionately stuck at the rank of associate professor and are not able to move up in rank. Epistemic exclusion works by those who have disciplinary power, barring entry to those that work on the disciplinary margins. And white men are more often going to be at the center, whereas women and people of color are more often at the margins. So epistemic exclusion is contributing to a lack of diversity in academia overall. And to reduce epistemic exclusion, one of the strategies is to encourage departments and search committees to have explicit conversations about what are their disciplinary values. These values are often unstated, and they certainly are not interrogating how are they impacting our department, our discipline, our recruitment. So one example would be the University of Michigan, where my colleague Isa Settles is. They've started having workshops for all new searches and for promotion and tenure committees that explicitly talk about epistemic exclusion as a piece of how bias is perpetuated, and what are their values, what is the purpose of the search, what are the explicit goals around promotion and tenure, and they use this as an opportunity to directly counter the way epistemic exclusion has influenced these processes in the past. And of course, another major shift is going to be thinking about how we think about value and how we value the work that is situated along the margins. So we could be talking about the same work, and we can be thinking of it as marginal, or we could think about it as being cross-cutting and cutting edge. This is often the way innovation is talked about, but somehow those same terms are not used when we're talking about research that is on marginalized people and topics. Along with shifting our thinking about the valued scholarship, we would need to see that this is aligned with shifts in policies and practices in how work is being valued. So this could be rethinking the appropriate metrics that we're using, such as valuing niche journals versus just valuing the mainstream journals. Or we might need to reduce our reliance on external metrics, such as grants and journal impact factors, as somehow telling us what research and scholarship is important or is making a contribution or is of quality. Finally, it's going to be helpful to reduce the defensiveness of our colleagues and the scholars that are working within the center, who we sometimes see are hearing this call for greater inclusion as a call to push them out. We do not believe that is the case. There is room for these more novel approaches and scholars, and creating space at the table does not detract from the contributions of mainstream work. There's room for all of us here. Academia can no longer afford to be dismissive of the critical ways in which our multiple social group identities actually intersect to inform our individual experiences in our research. Furthermore, our research practice and our theories are going to continue to be limited to the extent that we keep resisting broadening our work and actively embracing theories that allow us to properly contextualize our scholarship. The kinds of changes that I'm proposing here are going to really be a radical departure from our norms in academia. But they're also radically and desperately needed. We need this for our scholarship to remain relevant for the US of today, for the US of tomorrow, and for our increasingly diverse global society, and for our contributions to scholarship on the global context. Scholarship requires both critical inquiry and critical praxis. Academia, in my opinion, is standing at a fork in the road. One path will continue our status quo, rarely considering thoughtful analysis of diversity, intersectionality, social justice in our day-to-day practices, and perpetuating this environment that often is hostile and alienating for individuals who embody diverse and multiply marginalized identities. And in the space that actively rejects the critical research that's being done in these domains. But the alternative path, the path that I am hoping a broader swath of academia will take, is embracing the richness and the nuance that is involved when we do work that is centering social justice, and when we're centering diversity and creating spaces for those topics to exist within our scholars, theory, and our research. This path is likely to significantly increase diverse scholars in the academy. This is likely to transform the nature of the questions asked within our research, the manner that we're conducting our interventions, and the relevance of our work for the populations that we're serving. So if you're interested in learning more about some of this work, you can find some of our related papers at ResearchGate, or of course, you're welcome to contact me directly. And I will also put some of the related papers that you might be interested in if you found this talk interesting and you want to learn more. And I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, NiCole. Right now we have in the queue a comment that I'll read, and you can react to it if you want. And then we have an individual who requested to speak, and so she'll be second, and then a couple of questions. There's 4 in the queue, and we'll get started with the comment. I'll go ahead and read these. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and this is the comment. I'm sitting here feeling a bit distracted by the slide that lumps together Asians and non-Hispanic whites as non-underrepresented, without acknowledging the historical and continued discrimination faced by Asians that may have contributed to their proportion in traditional STEM disciplines. Ironically, the next slide talks about unacknowledged stressors, which is what happened on the previous slide. This is just a comment, and I do appreciate this talk overall. So I don't know if you want to respond to that or react to that.
I do. And you know, first I'll apologize because I realized in hearing it reflected, the way I talked about it didn't didn't communicate things the way I wanted to in my head. So I'm sorry about that. That is absolutely my responsibility as the speaker. In talking about that, we were specifically talking about just numerical representation compared to their representation in the US. And we do find that for some metrics, Asian faculty have experiences that are more similar to white faculty, but that's very limited. When we look at their overall experience of being treated like perpetual foreigners, of being shunned and excluded, like those things still hold for Asian faculty. So in that context, I wanted to talk about who's kind of making inroads in their numerical representation, but that does not change the kinds of often really negative, horrible experiences, which also in our time in the US right now, we have to acknowledge Asian faculty, our Asian citizens are not having better experiences. It may be slightly different the way they are marginalized, but they are absolutely also marginalized. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to respond to that.
Thank you. The next question will come from Rocio Quispe-Agnoli. And Rocio, I'm going to allow you to talk. So you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Michael. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're good to go.
Yes. Thank you very much, NiCole. Great presentation, and I have taken a lot of notes about it. I am a professor of Spanish in the Romance and Classical Studies department here at Michigan State, and my question has to do with language, and I talk about diversity in language because I have been saying this for the last 10 years. I have said this to the DEI committees at the university, that language is the big absent in all these discussions of DEI. And by that, I mean that knowledge is not only produced in English, it is also produced in other languages. So for instance, and I'll give the usual example that we have in my department, my colleagues who are not in my department tend to think that the only we do in the Spanish program is to teach Spanish as a second language, which is not the case. We create knowledge at all levels in the Spanish language, and I'm sure this applies to other languages that are not English. And we publish, and we are expected to publish in Spanish and in English, which means that we have to publish outside of North America, North American venues. And this scholarship or this production is not taken, it remains in the margins, let's put it this way. It remains in the margins not in annual evaluations, but and not in promotion and tenure. I had no problem going through these processes myself, but it remains in the margins for recognition, acknowledgement. It's invisible. It remains invisible because it's producing other languages other than English. And I tie that to something you said at the end. What do we value? So what an academia and MSU values? It doesn't seem to value knowledge produced in other languages because they don't understand it. And the other thing also, I was chair for 1 year of my department, and that's when I got used to metrics like academic analytics. And what I found out was really worrisome because academic analytics is a metrics that comes from, I think, England. I remember, and its measures excluded completely anything that was not published or recognized as a publication or a production of knowledge in English. So lots of things that I have published, not only me, but my colleagues as well, and have received prestigious awards, not in English, were not included. Therefore, they are not counted. Therefore, they are not included in the metrics that the college needs to present to the university to request funding. So my my simple question after this long intervention is why language is not included in these criteria for epistemic inclusion?
I think that's an excellent point. And we're actually going right from here to a grant meeting with this project. So it'll be one of our pieces of conversation. I will say that we did see variability in citizenship and in language spoken, or whether the first language, faculty's first language was English or not. And you're absolutely right. They were treated very differently, but also the way in which their experiences in another country than coming to the US, that did change how they were treated, as well as often the research that they did. Now, I'm going to go back and look through our qualitative data. I don't remember this particular issue coming up as the work that I do in another language is devalued or is not even recognized whatsoever. I'll have to go back and see if that comes up. But I think this is also one of the beautiful things about presenting this work with new audiences, because there are ways in which epistemic exclusion itself shapeshifts, and it's going to shapeshifts in ways that are specific to the kinds of work people are doing. I can say also there was a similar issue. My work is often published in lots of different domains that's not tracked by Web of Science. And for the first 15 or so years here at MSU, over half of my citations were never officially counted for my reviews because they were happening in fields that aren't captured by Web of Science. If you look at Google Scholar, it captured all of it, but it was a fight to get that recognition. So yes, I can absolutely see and understand how a similar process would be happening based on the work that you're doing in Spanish. Did you say it was Spanish?
Mine is Spanish, but if you ask that question to any foreign language department, you will find the evidence that you didn't find in the service. Yeah, that is a constant.
I would love to know, is it truly the same for any of the languages? Does German have as hard a time being recognized? But it's an empirical question that our team will start to think about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rocio.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michael. I just wanted to say for the last 5 years or 4 years, I have been bringing this up as a criteria for the DEI committees at MSU. Nothing. It appears nowhere. Language. And because speaking with an accent, for instance, it does have an impact on our teaching evaluations or for many other processes at the university. So I'm just giving a very specific example. Thank you.
Thank you,
Rocio.
For that comment.
So we're past time, but we have 2 other questions, both of which I think are really important. So I'd like to put these forward to NiCole, and you're welcome to stay with us if you'd like. This way they'll be a part of the recording. So you could come back to the recording if you want and pick up NiCole's responses to these questions. But I'll start with a question from Laurie Van Agren. The issue you raised regarding epistemic exclusion, the issues raised regarding epistemic exclusion are familiar as well in the community engaged scholarship realm. Women and faculty of color are proportionally more likely to do community engaged research and other scholarship than are men and white faculty. Can you speak to this within the context of your work?
Well, you're hitting it exactly on the head. Like, this is something that comes up over and over and over again. And again, the way that community scholarship is done, it's different in a lot of ways. And so it's not only devalued, but that lack of knowledge about what it takes to do community engaged work and the time that requires. And one of the things our group has been talking about is what is actually kind of quantifiable on our annual review forms and what things are not. And time spent in the community developing the relationships, doing work that actually brings the community in as a partner, it's on a completely different timeline. And none of the ways in which you have to do this work are captured in our evaluation processes. And when they're not captured in your evaluation process, then they might as well, like, they don't formally exist. And it's very difficult to get the recognition that's needed for people that are doing that really intensive work. So this is an issue that comes up, and where we often hear people talk about anything related to the community is in service. It comes up over and over again where I need to do work that is in service of my community, and often majority member scholars don't have that same pull. But we need to also be recognizing and talking more about that is also what's happening with our community engaged research and scholarship. And that doesn't get discussed in formal circles, but it actually absolutely has been coming through in the research that we're doing. Can't hear you.
The last question for today comes from Kevin Elliott. This talk was wonderful. Thank you, NiCole. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the NIH, which seem to be recognizing exactly the problems you're highlighting. In other words, there's a realization that underrepresented scientists are less likely to receive NIH grants because their research has the more marginal characteristics, quote unquote, you discussed early in the talk. Toward the end of the talk, you offered some great suggestions for how to handle epistemic exclusion, but I wondered if you could comment on how you might apply those ideas to the NIH. If you were to give the NIH some concrete suggestions for how to fix the problem they've identified, what would you recommend?
So a couple of things. One, the paper that is available now in Open Science does talk a little bit about funding priorities and how NIH and NSF might begin to rethink their processes. But this is a real difficult challenge, because NIH and NSF have been doing things for at least 10 years to try to actively increase the diversity of their PIs. And they found that they had exactly zero change. I think for NSF, the number was 55% when they looked at it. And then they looked and they found that the acceptance rates for PIs of color was still only 55%. So they did all of this work and nothing changed. When we were talking with our NSF program officer recently, one of the shifts that they're looking at is, rather than trying to just go and find how do we get that individual person funded, instead starting to look at how is systemic racism and variety of isms embedded within the entire process, and that is actually what is undergirding all of the disparities that we're seeing. So maybe we need to actually go and dig everything up and begin to explore what's happening. But I think there are some obvious things that could be done. One of the things that happens with NIH, they found that when people of color were submitting grants, they were often submitting grants that maybe did not have a biological component. And so they were being discounted because they weren't looking at biological factors. They were looking at more social contextual factors. There's no reason why the priority has to only be about biology. It's National Institutes of Health, and we know that it's not just a biological, health is not just biological. So it does not need to have taken the focus it has, but by prioritizing a particular focus, it has excluded the interests of many diverse scholars. So in and of itself, looking at their priorities and how they came to those priorities and how they can then open them up to be more inclusive. There is two forms of bias. There's bias against groups, and there's bias in favor of your own group. And in-group favoritism is actually quite strong and influential. So looking at who are we having on our review panels? Are we having individuals who are doing the kind of research that's being evaluated? Work that doesn't have this biological component, that has a social and potentially political focus? Are there people that are reviewing that work that have that kind of expertise? Or are they constantly still going to reviewers that have only done biological work all their life and value that and don't understand this other stuff, and so they automatically end up discounting it? There is some interesting research that talks about when you start meetings and when you set the priorities and encourage people to be knowledgeable of their implicit biases and then be accountable to it, you do get better review processes. I don't know to what extent that they're actually opening meetings or setting the expectation that people will be mindful of those things. And there's also room for program officers to make some executive decisions that will then diversify the research that they're funding, and kind of giving program officers more encouragement to take that kind of path would be one of many, many different options. But there's a long legacy of people calling for action that would have impact on funding agencies if they chose to take them up. So I won't try to replicate the very many different recommendations that are out there, but they could choose to do so. I've heard rumors that NSF is actively beginning to shift to address some of those concerns, but it's not unknown information, it's unacted on information.
Fantastic. Thank you, NiCole, very much for the presentation and for your wonderful answers to the questions. And thanks everybody for, again, taking time out of your day to spend with us. There will be another University Interdisciplinary Colloquium in 2 weeks. We invite you to join us for that. It'll be another excellent talk, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed being able to share this work with you today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. You should read the chat. There was another comment, but Kevin replied, and then, but also Miles dropped a comment in there too.
Oh, I don't know how, do I know?
Do you know
how to
Miles?
Download the chat. Oh, this is really great to read.
I'm going to actually allow Miles to talk. I don't know if he's on the way out, but he's somebody that Stephanie and I have worked with, and the center works with UOE, so Miles is in outreach and engagement, and on knowledge integration. And we just had a panel in the fall. I think it was the fall, like kind of all running together. Maybe it was this semester, on knowledge integration involving Indigenous education. So we focused on it. We have people from all over the country talking about K-12 Indigenous education, and anyway, it was fabulous, and it was kind of like some of these issues are in the background of the work that was presented in that talk or in that panel. Thank you. I guess I'll see you in a minute.
Yes, let's bring some of these ideas to the group.
All right. Yeah, this is fantastic. Thank you. I'm really grateful to have you be a part of it, and I really liked your answers to the questions. I was going to ask something like, if nobody asked a question, which wasn't going to happen, I was going to ask something along the lines that Kevin asked. Do you know Kevin?
Yeah, so Kevin has a past grant with ISIS,
right?
And so I kind of ancillarily got to meet him and know him, and then he has been so consistent. I think almost every talk I've given on any of the faculty data on campus, he's managed to be at. It's been really, awesome. Really amazing. It's been great.
Yeah, he's amazing. No doubt about it. Yeah, I figured that maybe through ISIS you would have met him because of his work with Kendra Charavello and Georgina and Pat Serrano and others. Well, I'm going to let you go. We're both late, but if I come in our next meeting more or less at the same time as you, then I'll be fine.
And I'm gonna sneak and heat up food super fast.
Do it. I might wind up if I beat you to the meeting, I'll let them know. But
okay, perfect.
I'll see you in a minute.
Thank you.
Thanks, NiCole. Thank you, Stephanie.
Great. It was so great.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, Stephanie.